So we have spent a lot of time this morning talking about money narratives. We've talked about how stewardship is a contextual ministry and that our stories often drive our language around giving. We talked about how stewardship is not just a means to ministry, but it is the ministry in and of itself, where we take people as they are a whole being and invite them for the repair of the world through giving. What we also talked about was that if it is true that stewardship is ministry, that means that we have to take into account the entire context an individual comes to us with. Their experience of God, cultural factors, and generational factors, which leads us into this afternoon. Oh, I'm so delighted. So this afternoon, we are going to talk about generational factors that impact strategy, messaging, vehicles. Before we do, a couple caveats. The first caveat, what you may have seen earlier, and something I haven't mentioned, is that I'm the co-founder of a nonprofit called the Collective Foundation. The nonprofit Collective Foundation is an arm of the Vandersall Collective, but it actually started before I even came on board with Vandersall Collective. It became clear to me 5 years ago in the midst of a training session where, picture this, I was with 14 dioceses in Colorado, 14 bishops all looking at me, and a bishop, beautiful question comes from this bishop. He stands up, Bishop Eugene Sutton from Maryland stands up and says to me, he says, "The data that you've just given me reflects the white parishes that are in my diocese. What data reflects congregations of color?" And I was like, oh boy, I don't have that. And then I did the thing that sometimes I do. I asked, does anybody else have it? And no one had it. And so then I promised, because I was ignorant, I promised him that I would get him this data. And because I thought it would be really easy to get. And so I went to every single denominational head, and every single denomination said, oh, we've been meaning to get that data. Once you get it, we'll use it. Everyone, ELCA, Methodists, Methodist Foundation, we went to Lake Institute, we went to Lilly, we went to Pew, we went everywhere. So, what did that mean? I need to break it down. Why am I talking about this right now? What it means is that without data that reflects congregations of color, including the national data where one might suppose people of color are participating, but currently all the data out there is minimal. It's not statistically relevant. It means that people like me continue to speak to you all about data that's been filled out by people that are not of color. And we continue to teach practices that are very minimally based, very narrowly based. So we created a nonprofit foundation to pay for this research to be implemented. And you'll be pleased to know the Episcopal Church led the way. House of Bishops put $100,000 towards it, and all the other denominations, including the Lutheran denomination, they came alongside. And so last year, 2019, we implemented all of the research, and in 2020, spring, April, we will be publishing the first ever results, ever. So that's going to be big, because what that means is that we can now start talking about strategies like I will be doing this afternoon based on the entire breadth of the diversity of our church, rather than a limited sector of it. So I say all that to mean, but what I'm about to give you will be adapted after this research comes out. Secondly, I'm about to talk to you about generational characteristics. However, there is a bit of a caveat that goes into talking about generational giving. The first is that this definition, generalizations make sense when talking about thousands of people, but not when talking about one person, the person you know. Applying a valid statistical generational characteristic to one person is stereotyping. So what I'm about to speak to you about is in generalization, If you want to know what one person needs, you should probably ask them. Based on the questions that we talked about earlier this morning, right? Okay. So we'll be talking about larger groups. You might even, when I'm talking about larger groups, think of outliers to that generalization. Totally fine, because people are unique. But we'll be talking about groups. So one of the things that's been very tricky about teaching stewardship in recent years is that unlike the church of the 1920s or the 1930s, we have more generations on a Sunday morning sitting in your pew than ever before. Because back in the 1920s and 30s, the average age to live was, does anybody know? 60, 62. And now the average age to live is 87. So, modern healthcare has changed how many people remain in our pews. Or, rather I should say, who remains in our pews. So, what you'll see here is that for the first time ever in the history of the church, we now have 5 churches on a Sunday morning, or 5 generations on a Sunday morning. We have the silent or the greatest generation. We have baby boomers. We have Gen Xers. We have millennials, and then post-millennials. We're calling them Gen Z, but some people call them, we'll talk about this later, some people call them boomlets. I know, it's a terrible name. Anyway, yeah, I know. 5 generations. No wonder it's tricky sending out a single letter, because you're not going to reach everybody, right? You've got different people doing different things, hearing different things, bringing their whole story. So here we get to the next caveat. I told you earlier that I heard a lot of stories about the golden age of the church. And I want to be clear, these generational characteristics are not meant for us to look back and say, in the old days, this was the way we did it. And I even appeal to you using scripture. So in Ecclesiastes we read, do not say, why were the old days better than these? For it's not wise to ask such questions. What we find is that oftentimes with this generation's work, a generation may be inclined to bash another generation. And that is not going to happen today. I will not at any point talk about what the problem of this generation is, because I don't find it helpful. Rather, when thinking about stewardship as a ministry, we recognize that each generation comes with its own needs, its own cultural context, its own desires. And our job in making it a ministry is reaching people where they are, not where we want them to be. So, you will not hear me bashing. All right, we already talked about this. So I want to talk about the greatest generation. And for those of you who have said to me, it seems as though our giving, number-wise, meaning the number of gifts, seems to be dwindling, but the average of our gift seems to be increasing. Many of those that are making up those larger gifts come from this generation. Defined by the greatest depression, World War II, patriotism, loyalty to the church, a strong sense of obedience. These are folks for whom this language of, if we all just did our part, may align, right? If we all just did our part. But these are folks for whom there's a real significant trust of governance and of authority. These are folks for whom a bishop might come on a Sunday morning, or they might have memories of a bishop coming on a Sunday morning and saying, we need money for X, Y, and Z, and they give. Why? Because an authority asked them to. They didn't need a narrative report. They don't need a peer-to-peer ask. They don't need to see the outcome, an authority figure. And why is that? Because this was a generation for whom Folks were living in community, but the radio transformed their experience of how they received the news, right? A single voice over the radio came on, and suddenly they were connected to a world that was outside of their own home. A single voice came on and they trusted what they heard because they had no other news to know, right? These were folks for whom oftentimes they make your strongest converted group. And within that, there's a subset called the silent generation, valuing loyalty, conformity, married early. So oftentimes what you'll hear from this generation is that they have markers of adulthood that they have clearly defined. Marrying early, setting up a home, having left home, having children, right? Not every generation married at the same age that, by and large, this generation did. This was a generation for whom the church was the community center. So for this group, there are multiple methods for messaging, but one message that's very important is to talk about legacy. Your generation built to this church. You planted those trees. Now, can you leave us the legacy of making sure that this church continues for generations to come? These, out of all of the different generations, this is the generation for whom a visit by an authority figure may have the most amount of connection, whether that be the clergy or a senior warden or the head of a particular ministry. Okay. Baby boomer generation, defined by the idealism and freedom of the 1960s. This was a group for whom began to ask questions around what does it mean to be the institution, especially what does it mean to be church in the midst of changing culture. There was a rejection of establishment and routines. So this was a group for whom first asked, why do we have to pledge? And then they received an answer and they participated. But it wasn't just because that's what we do, we all do our part, but it was we pledge so we can build a budget. And this is how that budget is used. Self is more important than the group. Now, I need to unpack that statement. Self is more important than the group is not a negative thing in this context. So this was a group for whom they saw conformity, they saw the sacrifice their parents had made, and this was a group that said, you know, maybe I need to ensure that my family is well taken care of and has their needs provided for before I provide for charitable giving. Or this is a group that said, you know, maybe I need to go to therapy and look after myself before I can look after the needs of my family. It's a very positive thing in many ways. They have a desire to know how the gift is used. And so this is for whom, when the church started, many churches started making a shift in how they talked about stewardship, they started talking about impact, right? Impact statements became a real big thing, right? We have to know how 99 cents of every dollar is used. Do you all know what Charity Navigator is? Does anybody know what Charity Navigator is? Let me tell you what Charity Navigator is. Charity Navigator is it's essentially an assessment that was set up by specifically baby boomers that wanted to be able to look at nonprofits and rate them so that people would be able to make a good investment of their charitable dollar. Specifically for these donor needs, right? People wanted to know with transparency because of a lack of trust in the establishment or trust in authorities. They wanted to know how their dollar was used, and so they needed a rating scale. And so Charity Navigator was born. So there is a significant need here then for this particular generation around transparency in light of mistrust of institutions. This is a group where the church stopped being the primary place for their charitable giving, but rather folks started to give in a variety of different places because they wanted to make the largest amount of impact, right? And so they had other values that drew their giving away. It might be to education or to health or to museums. And so there's this language that's very different that can come with talking to this generation, because the language cannot assume, won't you join me in giving to the church when you make that invitation? You can't assume that then that would be the only gift this generation is making. It now becomes, won't you prioritize our parish over other places you could be giving? We know that you are generous givers in your community. Won't you prioritize us? This is the group for whom the narrative budget became really important. Does anybody know what a narrative budget is? Aha, yay, Mitch, good, I'm glad to see that. A narrative budget takes what would typically be an Excel spreadsheet and provides greater transparency. It provides compelling language and photos, breaks out the numbers, and applies them to the missional imperatives of your congregation. This is a group for whom dropping a language of obligation can be pretty significant. This idea of shame, of if everybody does our part, having actual recipients of gifts speaking, and appealing to idealism. So I want you to take a moment at your table and ask this question of each other. How would your invitation, using a broad definition of invitation, whether it be text or email or direct one-to-one, how would your invitation to a greatest generation potential donor look different from that of a baby boomer? What would look different? I'm going to give you 5 minutes to talk about this as a group, and we'll see what you all come up with. Be prepared to share in 5 minutes. All right, Generation X, what I think of as probably the most misunderstood generation by terms of generational characteristics. Defined by individualism, single-parent households, Watergate, first generation of latchkey kids. What did that mean? It meant that both parents were probably working and they came home and they let themselves in. Why does that matter with giving? Why do you suppose that matters with giving? It matters because for folks that had to come home and give, there was a certain level of resourcefulness that came with that, a sense of growing up, a sense of early adulthood measures that took place with that. There was a sense of, I have to take care of myself because parents aren't home to do it right now. Many, I should say, of the generational cohorts that I bring together of Gen Xers talk about their feeling around first experiencing Y2K, which I think is really fascinating. Remember when we thought the clock was going to impact? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Coupled later, consultants like me, there tends to be a higher number of consultants upon Generation Xers, like to be able to create new things and to be able to own their own time. Cynical of authority. The first generation not to do as well financially as their parents did. This is an interesting fact. We'll move or transition jobs 5+ times. If you were to take me as an example, I moved 10 times in 10 years before settling into Minnesota. Why is that important? I was doing an annual campaign for Trinity Wauwatosa in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin. And the church noted that there were a significant number of members that were no longer there, that they had moved, but that they would come back for baptisms because they hadn't found another church. They would come back to have their weddings or their funerals because they hadn't found a church family. And yet they had stopped inviting them to give because they weren't there. But those folks still considered themselves part of the church family. In fact, they clued in onto Facebook to see what was happening, right? So these are folks for whom they wish to experience church, though they may not attend regularly. That doesn't mean that there isn't a connection for giving there, that there's not a relational tie there. The messaging for Generation X quite often connects in this way. We are a people, a community who cares about each other, putting individuals in front. It's not the greatest impact of our gift, but rather there are ministries that are important to us. Won't you join us in giving to support these things? These are folks for whom the year-round giving becomes especially important. Do you know why? Because we all know what happens in the fall. Fall is when you open up your mailbox and there are lots of appeals, right? We know that PBS and PR, lots of different folks are going to be asking for money in the fall. Again, really good idea to start early on your pre-election campaign. So this is for whom having a year-round stewardship plan allows not for you to ask all year. That's not a year-round stewardship plan, right? You're not asking all year, but rather you're providing education and formation and thanking people 7+ times, thanking people all year round. Because I happen to know some folks of this generation, especially amongst the clients that I work with, that particularly don't show up in the fall until they know that stewardship season is over, right? So how are they going to get stewardship education? How are they going to hear about how transformation and drawing closer to a God that loves them? How are they going to hear that? Year-round giving. What would it look like if on a Sunday morning, after Mitch hears a beautiful choir anthem like what we heard today, Mitch stands up and says to the congregation, "Thank you so much to the choir for that beautiful anthem and to all of you who give to our church. It's because of you that," I'm putting up a number here, 18.2% of our budget goes to choir ministries, and we're really grateful that you have given so we could do this, right? There's no ask. You're thanking volunteers, and people ask, well, how do I include time, treasure, and talent? With that thank you, you just have. You've acknowledged all three that are brought in and provide transparency for giving. Don't just focus on the fall. Allow to work independently for their agency and on their own terms. What does that mean? That's the we've always done it this way versus the here. Does my I don't know. We've always done it this way versus we would like you to do this. We know you bring your gifts and talents. These are the parameters. Do it as you see best. Right?
Can I ask a question?
Sure, of course you can.
Do all churches take pledges once a year at the same time?
So,
Or can you pledge throughout the year?
That's a great question. I certainly hope people can pledge all throughout the year because you're going to have newcomers come in the door, right? And part of their newcomer education will be what does it mean to be a member and how to pledge. I can tell you that the majority of Episcopal churches that I have worked with, as well as Presbyterian and Methodist, tend to have a fall drive. I have worked with a few that do spring. But the idea is, I would think around year-round stewardship, is not that you are asking in February for a pledge, but rather you are thanking and educating and providing a language of stewardship. So that's where this idea of what is the theology of stewardship becomes really important. Because if the language of stewardship is, won't you join me in giving to meet our budget? That looks real different in February than, won't you join us in using our gifts to repair the world. Right? That's a very different language.
It seems like we take the pledge cards when it's convenient for us, not necessarily for the person who's giving.
I like that. And that might be worth exploring in your congregation to ask some of those questions to see when is the best time. That's great. All right. So, how would your invitation to a Gen X potential donor look different from that of a baby boomer? I am going to give you 5 minutes as a group to discuss this. Now, this time, I'm going to be calling on different tables. So, please be ready to give an idea. All right, how would your invitation to a Gen X potential donor look different from a baby boomer? And go. Second to last, millennial generation. Defined children of divorce, celebrating diversity, socially conscious. Parents are advocates and friends. There's a new given, which is debt and technology. So oftentimes, I'm always asked, what's the magic bullet with the millennial generation? And in fact, I was doing a seat presentation once where I prefaced it by saying, people always ask me where the millennials are in church. And there was, in that workshop, this whole group of millennials who actually started raising their hands and saying, we're right here! We're right here, stop asking the question, just see us, please. And I thought that was really fascinating to me, because what Pew says is that many of the donor characteristics of this generation echo those, in terms of giving, of that of the greatest generation. Isn't that great news? It's fabulous news. And why is that? It's because, for many reasons. One, for many in the millennial generation, to participate in school, participate in church, there was a high level of volunteerism expected, right? They're grown up seeing how their participation in the community is important and it matters. And so giving, in some way, is already built into their formation, which is amazing. Well, another piece of this is that in terms of giving, you'll see 97 to 98%, depending on what year you look at, millennial giving, 97 to 98% are giving to nonprofits of some sort, of varying amounts. Isn't that incredible? One of the things that happened in not the 2016 presidential election, but the 2012, thank you, I can do math, 2012 presidential election was that we saw the fundraising landscape change again, right? What happened with this was that the Obama campaign sought to raise funds specifically from this generation. And so they changed how they did fundraising, and they changed it on its head. And so they started sending out emails saying, we need $5, $10, $15, right? Weekly. And guess what happened? The millennial generation, they did not ask for a Charity Navigator report. They did not ask for a 5-star rating. They did not ask for a narrative report, right? A narrative budget. Nor did they need a bishop to come in and ask. All they needed, right, was that email. The email asking, and they gave. They don't know where 99 cents of their dollar went. They gave. That's amazing to me. So the messaging for the millennial generation is interesting. Your gift is important, it will impact lives, but now how can we get to know you? How are you seen? One of the things that's different, however, from the millennial generation, from that of the greatest generation, is this. There's oftentimes a desire for immediate gratification of giving. Not that they would see their gift immediately used, but there's an acknowledgement that they have given. So this is a group for whom I'm sure many of you write in beautiful handwriting thank you notes, right? lovely and intentional. Don't want you to stop doing that. I would love for you to perhaps consider how within 24 hours you could add a text function or an email function that automatically sends a note back to folks in your pews that say, we received your gift, thank you so much. You'll be receiving another follow-up thank you from us, but acknowledges within 24 hours that a gift has been received. For many, timeliness is just as important as the intentional note. Online community presence. For many, a church that I go to, I'll say, so where are y'all at with online community presence? And they'll say, well, we have a Facebook group. We publish all of our things on the Facebook group. And I said, so what level of conversation is taking place? And they're like, well, it's really more of a monologue. And I'm like, well, that's really not an online community presence because communities don't tend to take place in monologues. All right? So thinking about how there's mutuality in the conversation. All right. Finally, I want to move real quick because time is of the essence to the Generation Z/boomlets. Why are they called boomlets? There are some reports coming out of Pew that are hypothesizing that the following generation from the millennial generation are showing similar characteristics to baby boomers, which is why the name is coming into play. However, this is the first generation that saw the last name Smith as the most common last name in the U.S. This is the first generation for whom Rodriguez was the more common last name than Smith. Highly diverse, seeing a changing landscape for what that means around language. So not just the words that we use, but how are those words translated to those that are in our pews? How is it culturally accessible? The number of births in 2006 far outnumbered the start of the baby boomer generation and will easily be the largest generation. So when thinking about stewardship as a contextual ministry, it becomes really important then that you learn who are in your pews so that you're able to contextualize and adopt your invitation accordingly. So what I'm going to ask you to do, because oftentimes people hear me give all this information and they say, well, now I'm overwhelmed. And I get that. That's fair. Here's a way in which you can synthesize this information and use it. First of all, I want to set you free from the idea that 100% of those in your pews are going to give. It's not going to happen. All right? 100% will not. So instead of thinking if everybody will just do their part, what would it look like if you shifted and you started using that data analysis that we were talking about earlier? And you started using that data analysis to say, okay, I wonder how many Gen Xers we have. I wonder how many baby boomers we have. And I wonder what language we need to use for different groups. And what if we know one group we could start speaking directly to this year and do some targeted formation and perhaps start building up our donor base. Many people are concerned about what happens when the greatest generation passes away. This is an excellent strategy to address that. What would it look like if you started seeing folks that if they prioritized their giving, they could start becoming major donors in your congregation? They just need to be asked in a way to be heard. What would it look like for folks that are of the Generation X group, that if their experience was tied to giving, if they were invited into an experience that was different from just a letter, if they were spoken to all year round in a formational way, right? What would it look like for them to be invited to become a major donor? So identify where you have growth potential and start to think about, okay, this year we're going to focus on, not that not everybody gets invited but perhaps we're going to align some of our strategies this year. Maybe this year is the year where A particular group will hear information about IRAs directly, while as everybody will receive paper about it. Are there any questions about targeted formation?